Sunday began like so many others at the Butler house, with the smell of coal mingling with the salty air coming in from the sea. Laughter could be heard from the street, men talking about past missions, women setting the table, and children running barefoot on the lawn. Michelle had arrived early, as always, with a lemon tart in her hands and a rehearsed calm on her face. She had spent the last few years enduring the same jokes, the same gestures of male pride that filled the air every summer. No one there imagined that the quiet woman who silently served juice had piloted a plane under enemy fire in Mogadishu. No one knew that the hero of so many stories, Captain Roland Butler, owed his life precisely to her. That afternoon, the heat was stifling, and Cousin Zach, Roland's son, was more arrogant than usual. He boasted about his brief experience in the Gulf, exaggerating every detail, enjoying the attention everyone gave him. Michelle simply listened, watching as each word reinforced the image of the family's new hero. At one point he raised his beer and with a mocking smile asked her if she was still flying desks or if she'd finally worked up the courage to fly a real mission. Laughter filled the yard, even her own mother's. Michelle smiled, as if unaffected, but that smile was the last thread of a patience that had lasted too long. As the laughter slowly died away, Michelle placed her glass on the table and looked out at the sea, where the sun was beginning to set. No one noticed the slight trembling in her hands or the lump forming in her throat. For years, she had learned to breathe deeply, not to react, to maintain military composure, even in the face of family humiliation. At the base, she was respected for her discipline, but here, among her own people, she was barely the quiet niece. Her silence had become a shield, but also a prison, and for the first time, she felt she no longer wanted to be locked away in it. Roland watched the scene from the shadow of the porch, his gaze fixed on his niece. He knew what that collective laughter meant, but he did nothing. He had spent years keeping quiet, justifying his silence as a way to protect the family reputation. He had convinced everyone, and himself, that heroism should have a masculine face. Seeing his own son repeating that arrogance hurt him, even if he wouldn't admit it. However, that afternoon something changed inside him as well. He realized that silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only perpetuated an injustice that could no longer be sustained. The tension in the air gradually dissolved when someone turned on the music, and the children ran toward the sea. Michelle volunteered to clean the grill, as she always did, looking for any excuse to get away from the hustle and bustle. As she scrubbed the still hot grates, she remembered the night in Mogadishu, the roar of the engine, the heat rising from the ground, the radio calls for extraction. There was no time to hesitate. She had taken command, lowered the ship with surgical precision, and managed to evacuate the entire team, including her uncle. Sometimes she still dreamed of that moment, with the smell of burning metal and the feeling of being suspended between life and death. But in the years that followed, no one spoke of it. The mission had been classified, and Roland asked that the report omit his name. "For security," he said then. Michelle accepted it without question, believing it to be the right thing to do. However, time showed that it wasn't about security, but about pride. Every family reunion was a reminder of her anonymity. While others recounted exploits embellished with exaggeration, she learned to remain silent. But that afternoon, with the echo of Zach's mockery still in the air, she realized that her silence wasn't humility, but a form of surrender. And she was no longer willing to give in. The sun was beginning to tint the horizon orange when Michelle moved a little further from the house. She walked barefoot on the damp sand, leaving behind the noise of conversations and laughter. Each step was a mixture of anger and relief. She had spent half her life flying through storms, facing turbulence that could split a plane in two, but nothing had prepared her for the loneliness of being ignored by her own flesh and blood. At the base, her comrades called her Revenant One, the call sign born that night in Somalia when she returned against direct orders to rescue the trapped unit. But there, in that family yard, she was just Mitch, the quiet niece, the one who never raised her voice. From a distance, Roland watched her from the porch. His wife was speaking to him, but he barely listened. He had seen that look on soldiers returning from the front, the mixture of pride and pain that only those who have endured impossible decisions can understand. For the first time in many years, he felt ashamed. He knew he had allowed the lie to become a habit, for his son to learn. That courage only counted if he was wearing a male uniform. But that evening, watching Michelle walk alone along the beach, something inside him broke. Perhaps it wasn't too late to correct what he had kept quiet for so long. When the sky turned violet and the breeze began to cool her skin, Michelle sat on a rock, facing the sea. From there she heard the distant voices of her family, the jokes, the toasts, everything she'd kept quiet about for years. She thought about how ironic it was. She could land an aircraft in the middle of the desert under enemy fire, but she couldn't defend herself against mockery in her own home. For the first time, she allowed herself to cry, not out of pain, but out of exhaustion, because silence over the years also weighs like a backpack full of stones. At that moment, she decided she wouldn't remain silent again, even if she had no audience, even if the truth came too late. And if you're reading this far, tell me where you're with us from, because sometimes we keep silences that weigh more than we imagine. Michelle walked slowly back toward the house, her gaze serene and her eyes still moist. When she arrived, everyone was still laughing. No one noticed the difference, but she wasn't the same. That night there were no shouts or reproaches, only a change in attitude, almost invisible. She no longer flinched at the comments. She didn't look away when Zach spoke of true heroes. She observed him calmly, like someone watching a child who doesn't yet understand the weight of his own words. In the days that followed, something changed in the way Michelle walked, spoke, and breathed. It wasn't pride, but a newfound tranquility, the kind that comes when you stop justifying injustice. At the base, her colleagues noticed the change. She was still the same impeccable professional, but her gaze had a different firmness. That afternoon at the barbecue hadn't ended in scandal, but it had marked the end of an era. Sometimes, breaking points don't come with shouts, but with silences that choose not to repeat themselves. Roland, meanwhile, couldn't get what he'd seen out of his mind. His son's words, the laughter, his niece's restrained expression. For nights on end, he relived that mission in Somalia. The bursts of gunfire that tore through the air, the helicopter descending amidst the fire, and that voice on the radio, firm, serene, saying, "Equipment secured. We're returning to base." He hadn't forgotten the tone, but he had buried the name, and now, no matter how hard he tried, the weight of that omission fell upon him with unbearable force. A week later, Roland decided to visit the base unannounced. He claimed to be just passing through, but in reality, he was seeking something that had been tormenting him, confirming whether what he had done all those years ago was really necessary. When he entered the offices and saw the framed portrait of the distinguished pilots, his gaze fell on a plaque engraved with a name, Lieutenant Michelle Butler, Revenant One. There was no pomp or decoration, just a simple line below, "For acts of valor during a classified operation in North Africa." Roland felt a knot in his stomach. It was the truth written in metal, visible to everyone except those who refused to see it at home. That evening, Michelle was reviewing reports when she heard a knock at the door. When she opened it, she saw her uncle, dressed in his military jacket, standing with an expression that mixed guilt and pride. There were no hugs, no speeches, just a long, awkward silence, filled with everything that hadn't been said for years. Roland thanked her quietly, and she barely nodded. She didn't need to hear more. The true apology wasn't in the words, but in the presence. For the first time, he had crossed the wall that separated them. For the first time, he saw her not as the obedient niece, but as the woman who had flown through the fire to save him. After that visit, Roland stopped. Attending barbecues for a while. He said he was tired, but in reality he needed to confront his own guilt. The image of Michelle piloting under fire kept him awake at night. He remembered how, upon returning from that mission, his superiors had praised him for staying calm, and instead of correcting them, he had simply nodded. He had allowed the glory to cover himself, and not the one who truly deserved it. He realized too late that his silence had not only robbed his niece of recognition, but had also distorted the notion of honor he claimed to uphold. Meanwhile, Michelle continued with her routine, but no longer burdened by the approval of others. She had learned to be at peace with herself, to understand that courage doesn't need witnesses. However, something inside her knew that chapter wasn't yet closed. Public acknowledgement didn't matter to her, but she felt the truth had to be told, even if it was just once, even if it hurt. And fate, capricious as ever, would give her that opportunity sooner than she imagined. Another family reunion, organized to celebrate Zach's promotion to lieutenant. The house was as full as ever. The same laughter, the same smell of grilled meat, the same stories repeated over and over. But this time, the atmosphere had a different quality. Michelle arrived in her uniform, not out of ostentation, but because she'd come straight from the base. Zach was the first to approach, with that confident smile he always used to hide his insecurity. He thanked her for coming, and in front of everyone, began to relate one of his combat anecdotes, exaggerating every detail. Michelle listened without interrupting, but something about her posture, the serenity with which she held her gaze, the firmness of her shoulders, made Roland notice the difference. It was then that one of the guests, an old colleague of Roland's, raised his glass and unintentionally mentioned the name that for years no one had dared to utter, Revenant One. Silence fell. Suddenly, as if the air had stopped, Zach frowned, confused. The veteran continued speaking, laughing, unaware of the effect of his words. "I'll never forget that mission. If it weren't for it, neither Roland nor his team would be here." The phrase echoed in the garden. Roland stood up slowly, his face tense and his eyes moist. He knew he could no longer remain silent. Silence spread across the yard. Only the crackling of the grill and the distant sound of the waves could be heard. Roland took a few steps forward, his gaze fixed on his son. Zach still didn't understand what was happening, but the tremor in his father's voice made it clear. "You need to apologize," he said, his tone brooking no reply. "You've ridiculed the pilot who saved my team, and the woman who saved your father's life." The words resonated with a weight no uniform could hold. Zach paled, staring at Michelle as if seeing her for the first time. No one dared to speak. Even the youngest, who didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what they had heard, remained silent. Roland turned to his niece, and for a moment seemed older, more human. There were no speeches, no medals, no applause. Just a belated recognition that was worth more than any ceremony. Michelle said nothing. She just bowed her head in a slight gesture, not of submission, but of closure. The sound of the sea filled the void, and for the first time in years, the silence in the Butler house was not a condemnation, but a relief. That night, after everyone had left, Roland approached Michelle. He was holding a small, weathered metal box. He opened it without a word and showed her a seal challenge coin engraved with the inscription, "To one who flew through the fire." It was one of the most personal decorations a soldier could present, a symbol of respect and gratitude. Roland held it for a few seconds before extending it to her. Michelle looked at it, and for the first time in a long time, she saw something resembling peace in her. Uncle's eyes, she accepted the coin, not as a reward, but as reconciliation. Roland spoke softly without looking directly at her. He said he thought silence would protect them both, that the world wasn't ready for a story like hers, a female pilot saving a squadron of men. But now he understood that the price had been too high. "I lost years of pride and a niece by hiding the truth," he murmured. Michelle listened without interrupting. There was no resentment, only tiredness. It was as if, finally, they had both landed after too long a flight. The sound of the waves accompanied that silent conversation between two generations who finally understood each other. As the months passed, the story transformed into a kind of family legend, but without exaggeration or embellishment. It was no longer a secret or a cause for shame. At every gathering, the younger members listened silently when someone mentioned Revenant One, and Roland took it upon himself to explain what had really happened, omitting nothing. Michelle didn't seek the limelight, but she didn't shy away from it either. She simply told the truth with the serenity of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. That summer marked the end of an era in the Butler family, one of shouting pride, replaced by listening respect. Zach, for his part, changed more than anyone could have imagined. He began writing letters to his aunt, asking for leadership advice, telling her about his own missions, trying to learn what he'd never been taught at home: humility. Michelle responded patiently, without rancor, with that firm, calm tone that always characterized her. One day, she sent him a replica of the seal coin and wrote a single sentence: "Courage isn't inherited, it's chosen." Zach understood that it wasn't about forgiveness, but rather a new opportunity to make things right. Years passed, and Michelle was assigned to new operations, always with the same discretion that had accompanied her since the beginning of her career. She wasn't interested in headlines or visible promotions, only in efficiency and a job well done. However, in 2021, she received an unexpected notification. The Navy was summoning her to a ceremony in Pensacola to officially recognize her participation in the classified mission in North Africa. She didn't know who had instigated this recognition, but she suspected her uncle was behind it. That intuition was confirmed when she arrived and saw him there, standing in his old, perfectly ironed uniform, waiting for her in front of the stage. The ceremony was brief, sober, almost intimate. When her name was called, everyone present, pilots, sailors, veterans, stood. Michelle strode forward to the podium, and when she turned to accept the salute, she found Roland raising his hand in a slow but impeccable military salute. For a moment, all the noise in the world died away. That gesture, more than any words, was the public apology she had never expected to receive. Niece and uncle, disciple and mentor, wife and soldier, finally recognized each other as equals. After the ceremony, Roland approached slowly, leaning on his cane, his voice cracking but steady. There were no speeches or formalities, just a brief sentence. "It was about time everyone knew who saved us." Michelle smiled, her eyes shining with suppressed emotion. She didn't reply because she knew she didn't need to. Sometimes words come late, but they still heal. That night, as she tucked the seal coin away, along with her newly received medal, she felt she could finally let go of everything she had carried for so many years. The resentment, the frustration, the silence. Time passed, and Michelle's life returned to calm. Summers were no longer what they had been. The family barbecues continued, but now the atmosphere was different. Less competition, more shared stories, more respect. The children listened fascinated as Roland told them about the mission, always ending with the same phrase, "Courage has no gender." Michelle simply watched, knowing that something had changed forever. In those moments, she understood that her story was not just hers, but a seed she had planted without realizing it. As the years passed, Roland aged serenely. His days of training, discipline, and command were behind him, but his mind remained as lucid as ever. He often sat facing the sea, a blanket draped over his legs, recalling that afternoon when he finally broke the silence. He said it had been the bravest act of his life. Michelle visited him frequently, and together they shared quiet conversations, free of blame or reproach. Nothing remained unfinished between them. They had learned that honor is not measured by what is left unsaid, but by the truth one dares to speak. And if this moment moved you as much as it did me, please share it. Maybe someone needs to hear that there's always time to acknowledge the truth. One summer, Roland's grandson, Evan, barely 12 years old, sat next to Michelle holding the seal coin. He asked her if she had been afraid that night. She replied without hesitation, "Of course I was, Evan. Bravery isn't not feeling it, it's continuing to fly anyway." The boy nodded silently, understanding something no military manual taught. From that day on, the story of Revenant One became a familiar symbol, not of war, but of integrity. Time passed, and the Butler family began to change their understanding of the word heritage. They no longer spoke only of medals, missions, or names engraved on plaques. Now they spoke of respect, empathy, and justice. Michelle watched with pride as the younger members, especially the girls, grew up knowing that courage didn't depend on gender or anyone's approval. At every gathering, someone would mention Revenant One with a mixture of admiration and gratitude, but without solemnity. It was a living story, told with laughter and affection, like truths that no longer hurt. When Roland passed away, the funeral was simple, with military honors and an intimate ceremony by the sea. Michelle placed the seal coin on the casket, just above the flag. It was her way of bringing things full circle. Zach, standing beside her, wept silently, holding his son Evan's hand. The sound of the waves accompanied the chaplain's words, and when the final honorary shot rang out in the distance, Michelle felt something inside her rest as well. There was no sadness, but gratitude. What began as a family wound had become a lesson that spanned generations. Over the years, Evan grew up and decided to follow a different path than his ancestors. He didn't enlist in the Navy or the Army. He chose to study aeronautical engineering, inspired by his aunt's stories of flight. He said he wanted to build machines that would help protect lives, not destroy them. Michelle supported him from the beginning, seeing herself reflected in his determination. Every time he visited her, he would ask to hold the seal coin for a few seconds, as if in that gesture he felt the power of everything that small metal piece represented: sacrifice, truth, and quiet courage. Michelle, now retired, moved to a small house by the sea, near the base where it all began. She spent her days walking along the beach, watching the seagulls and the planes crossing the sky. Sometimes she thought about that first barbecue, about the laughter, about Zach's mockery, about how everything changed from that moment on. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. She understood that sometimes fate chooses noise to awaken silence. And that, after all this, her story wasn't that of a woman who sought recognition, but of someone who learned not to hide her truth, even if it hurt. Every summer, Neighbors would see her walk barefoot along the shore at sunset, wearing a small gold pendant that held a fragment of the seal coin. She never spoke of her missions or her past, but those who knew her knew that behind that serenity lay a story that changed. An entire family. Michelle wasn't looking for admiration, she was looking for balance. In her home, she hung a single photograph on the wall, her and Roland facing the ocean on the day of the ceremony in Pensacola. No title, no date, just two people who finally found peace. Over time, some journalists tried to convince her to write a book, but she always refused. She said that true stories of courage don't need covers, only memories. Sometimes she received letters from young pilots, men and women, who said they had been inspired by her career. She responded with the same humility as always, expressing her gratitude, but reminding everyone that heroism lies not in the actions you see, but in the decisions you make when no one is looking. It was her way of continuing to teach, even though she was no longer flying. One afternoon, as the sky turned golden, Michelle found an old box among her things. Inside were her first flight patch, a photo of the team rescued in Mogadishu, and an unopened letter in Roland's handwriting. She hesitated for a few seconds before reading it. The message was short, direct, like he used to speak. "Thank you for giving me back my life, not just that night, but every time your silence reminded me what honor truly means." Michelle smiled with tears in her eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. The letter was the final echo of a story that had begun in darkness and ended in reconciliation. That night, he sat facing the sea with a blanket over his legs, watching the distant lights of ships on the horizon. The wind carried the scent of salt and memories. He closed his eyes and listened to the sound of the ocean, as if each wave whispered back what he had learned throughout his life, that silence can destroy, but it can also heal. And that sometimes the greatest victories are not those celebrated, but those experienced in calm, without spectators, with the certainty of having done the right thing. The following days were peaceful. Michelle would get up early, make coffee, and watch the planes take off from the window, with a smile that mixed nostalgia and satisfaction. She had dedicated much of her life to service, but she didn't regret anything. Her story, without seeking it, had become a lesson in courage and truth. The Butler family remembered her not as the silent pilot, but as the woman who changed the definition of heroism within a tradition marked by noise and pride. Sometimes Evan would call her from college to tell her about his projects, and each conversation ended the same way, with her repeating that courage isn't demonstrated, it's lived. One autumn afternoon, as the sun set over the ocean, Michelle placed the seal coin on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then she put it in a box, along with Roland's letter and a note in her own handwriting. For anyone who needs to be reminded that the truth always finds a way. She closed the box and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the photograph of Pensacola. The sound of the waves drifted in through the window, serene and constant. In that silence, the same silence that had once made her invisible, she finally found the peace she had sought all her life.